Nolan, a man in his early 30s, stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a plate under a steady stream of water. Soap suds clung to his hands as he worked, the clink of dishes a quiet rhythm in their cozy, almost too perfect home. In the living room, his wife Caitlin folded laundry with the precision of a surgeon. Each shirt, each sock assigned its place in neat, orderly stacks. 5 years of marriage had turned their little house into a museum of routine, every corner polished, every habit predictable. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind where nothing should go wrong. And yet, it did. It started innocently enough. Caitlin, holding one of Nolan's faded t-shirts, glanced over with a faint smile and said, "A real man should be obedient. That's when life gets happier." Her tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it, a condescending lilt, like she was talking to a kid who'd forgotten his homework. Nolan didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the plate, watching her reflection in the window above the sink as she smoothed his clothes into submission, deciding where everything belonged, just like she decided where he belonged in their life. He'd learned the drill by now. Argue too soon, and it'd spiral into a fight. So he nodded, gave a half-hearted, and moved on to a greasy frying pan. But tonight, her words didn't just bounce off him. They stuck. A real man should be obedient. It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, but maybe it was the way she'd smirked, or the way she'd compared him to a naughty toddler without even realizing it. Something deep inside him twitched, a nerve he didn't know was still alive. He set the pan down, water dripping from his hands onto the counter. "I'm your husband, Caitlin," he said, his voice low but steady. "Not your son." The room went still. Caitlin's hands froze mid-fold, a pair of boxers dangling awkwardly in her grip. She turned, her hazel eyes narrowing. "Excuse me? Care to repeat that?" Her tone was ice-cold, daring him to back down like he always did. Nolan wiped his hands on a dish towel, meeting her gaze. "You talk to me like I need to be trained, not loved." She let out a sharp laugh, a sound that stung more than any insult could. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Nolan. I'm just trying to make you better." She waved a hand dismissively, as if his feelings were a pesky fly she could swat away. "You're lucky I care enough to bother." The air thickened. Nolan felt his jaw tighten, but Caitlin wasn't done. She set the boxers down and crossed her arms, leaning into her argument like a lawyer on a roll. "You know, my mom, Margaret, always said men need a little guidance. My dad knew his place. Never argued, never complained. That's why they were happy. It's like the foundation of a good marriage." Nolan stared at her, the dishwater cooling in the sink behind him. Margaret. Of course. Caitlin's mother, the queen of unsolicited advice, whose husband had apparently spent 40 years nodding silently over his morning coffee. Nolan had met the guy, nice enough, but the man's personality seemed to have been ironed flat decades ago. Was that what Caitlin wanted? A husband who knew his place? Inside Nolan, something shifted. Not a loud crash, not a dramatic explosion, just a quiet snap, like a string stretched tight for years had finally given way. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just stood there, looking at the woman he'd promised to love forever, and wondered how long he'd been drowning in her version of better. The fight lingered in Nolan's head like a song he couldn't unhear. As he lay in bed that night, Caitlin's soft snores filling the silence, he stared at the ceiling and let the pieces fall into place. It wasn't just the obedient man comment. It was everything. Caitlin's fingerprints were on every corner of his life, smudged into places he hadn't even noticed until now. The budget? She'd taken over their finances for order's sake, doling out his allowance like a stern schoolteacher. His friends? They'd faded away one by one after her sly digs. "Oh, Mike's nice, but so immature." Or, "Why hang out with losers when you've got me?" Even that job offer last year, the one he'd been excited about, she'd shot down with a single line. "Too risky for our future." He'd nodded then, like always, because peace was easier than pushback. But now, in the dark, her words about her father echoed louder than ever. He knew his place. Was that what she saw in Nolan? Not a partner, but a project, clay she could mold into her vision of a real man? He turned his head, watching her sleep so peacefully, her face soft and angelic. It was hard to hate her. She wasn't cruel, didn't yell or throw things. She just steered. And somehow he'd let her steer him straight into a version of himself he'd barely recognized. A shadow in khakis, tiptoeing around his own life. The next morning, Nolan made a move. Nothing dramatic, no slamming doors or grand speeches, just a quiet rebellion. He Googled therapists near me on his phone while Caitlin was in the shower, then booked an appointment under the guise of a work errand. That afternoon, he sat in a small, cluttered office, facing a woman with kind eyes and a notepad. "She's not mean," he started, fumbling for words. "She doesn't scream or anything. She's persistent, caring even. But it's like I'm always wrong, and she's fixing me." The therapist leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Control doesn't always wear a loud costume, Nolan. Sometimes it dresses up as love or concern." She scribbled something, then handed him a list of books. "The Subtle Art of Manipulation, Codependent No More." "Start here," she said, "and don't feel guilty for wanting to breathe." He hid the books in his gym locker. Ironic, since he hadn't worked out in months, thanks to Caitlin's quip about wasting time on vanity. That evening, bolstered by a flicker of courage, he tried talking to her again. They were in the kitchen, her chopping vegetables with surgical precision while he hovered by the fridge. "I feel like I've lost myself in this marriage," he said, keeping his tone even. Caitlin didn't miss a beat. She kept slicing, the knife thwacking against the cutting board. "You're overthinking again, Nolan. Honestly, you're lucky I put up with this anxiety of yours." And there it was, the familiar pivot. Suddenly, it was about his flaws, her sacrifices. "I cook, I clean, I keep us on track. What more do you want?" He didn't argue. What was the point? She'd already won the script. But something had shifted. Later that night, alone with his laptop, he started Googling apartment listings, jotting down numbers in a notebook he stashed under the spare tire in his car. Freedom, he realized, wasn't going to come from a heart-to-heart. It was going to come from a packed bag and a new key. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of himself flicker back to life. Not loud, not bold, but stubborn as hell. And that was enough. Nolan was done drifting. The secret bank account was his first real anchor. Small transfers from each paycheck, a few bucks here, a few there, siphoned off like water from a leaking pipe. He'd gotten good at covering his tracks. Cash withdrawals disguised as coffee runs, a vague work-lunch excuse if Caitlin asked. But Caitlin wasn't the type to let a dime slip by unnoticed. She'd long ago made a habit of rifling through his wallet, counting bills like a hawk eyeing a field mouse, not to mention her iron grip on their joint accounts. It was only a matter of time. One evening, she caught the shortfall. Nolan was halfway through a microwave dinner when she stormed in, waving his debit card statement like a prosecutor with a smoking gun. "Where's the money, Nolan?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "You're short $187 this month. Explain." He set his fork down, stomach tightening. 5 years ago, he'd have stammered an apology, handed over receipts, begged for peace. Not tonight. "I earned it," he said, meeting her glare. "I can spend some of it how I want." Caitlin's face went red, then white, like a traffic light stuck on rage. "You're acting like a child," she snapped, launching into a lecture about responsibility, teamwork, her sacrifices. But this time, Nolan didn't shrink. He sat there, arms crossed, letting her words crash against him like waves on a cliff. She must have seen it, the steel in his eyes, because for once, she stopped short. With a huff, she stormed off, muttering about his attitude. It wasn't a victory, but it was a crack in the wall. After that, Nolan moved faster. He scanned his passport, birth certificate, tax returns, anything tying him to the world, and uploaded them to a cloud account she didn't know existed. At work, his voice sharpened, his shoulders straightened. Colleagues noticed. "You've got a presence lately, man," one said, clapping him on the back. Nolan just smiled, thinking of the gym locker stuffed with books he'd never dared bring home. Caitlin sensed it too. Over breakfast one morning, she squinted at him across the table, her coffee mug hovering midair. "You're different," she said, her tone half accusation, half probe. "Something going on at work?" "Big projects," he lied smoothly, stirring his oatmeal. "Deadlines piling up." She nodded, but her eyes lingered, searching for the truth he wouldn't give. Then came her counterattack. "We should visit Mom's lake house," she said later that week, voice syrupy with nostalgia. "Just us, some fresh air. Remember how fun it was last time?" Nolan remembered. All right, 3 days trapped with Margaret's passive-aggressive jabs and Caitlin's endless rules. No Wi-Fi, no escape. It was a cage dressed up as a getaway. "Maybe next month," he said, dodging her trap with a shrug. She didn't push, but her smile tightened. Days later, while Caitlin was out running errands, code for snooping on neighbors probably, Nolan met a landlord across town. The apartment was small, peeling paint, a sink that dripped, but it was his. He signed the lease with a pen that shook just a little, then pocketed the keys. Standing in the empty space, he inhaled the musty air, a wild mix of terror and thrill pumping through him. This was real. This was his. Back home, Caitlin was waiting. She sat on the couch, a mug of tea in hand, her smile so forced it looked painted on. "I've been thinking," she said, voice soft as a spiderweb. "Maybe I've been too hard on you. We should work on us." Then casually, she dropped the bomb. "I saw this book online. Addictive Relationships, Reclaiming Your Boundaries. Maybe we could read it together?" Nolan's blood turned to ice. He hadn't mentioned that book. Ever. But he remembered the therapist's email, the one with the reading list, sitting in his inbox. She'd been in his laptop again, maybe his email too. Her apology was a lure, a test to see how much he'd confess. He forced a nod. "Sounds interesting," he mumbled, then excused himself to bed. Lying in the dark, he didn't sleep. He planned. The final step was coming, and he'd be ready. The next morning, while Caitlin was off sipping lattes with a friend, Nolan moved with quiet purpose. 2 bags sat by the door, one stuffed with clothes and toiletries, the other cradling an old family rifle, a scratched-up heirloom from his grandfather. Caitlin had despised it, called it a dusty eyesore, and once even listed it for sale online behind his back. He'd caught the ad just in time, canceling it with a mix of panic and defiance. Now, as he zipped the bag shut, he smirked at the memory. If she hated it so much, she'd be thrilled it was leaving with him. On the kitchen table, he left a letter. No theatrics, just the truth. "This isn't a whim. It's years of control I can't take anymore. My lawyer's contact is below. Goodbye, Caitlin." He didn't linger to reread it. Grabbing the bags, he stepped outside, locked the door, and drove off. The first breath of air outside their house hit him like a shot of whiskey. Sharp, dizzying, free. That night, in his bare apartment, Nolan sat on a folding chair, the rifle propped in the corner like a silent roommate. The quiet was deafening, broken only by his phone buzzing relentlessly. Caitlin's messages rolled in like a storm. First confusion. "Where are you? What's going on?" Then fury. "You're throwing away everything we built." And finally tears. "Please come home. I'll change, I swear." He read them, but didn't reply. Each ping felt less like a tether and more like a ghost fading into the past. The next day, she escalated. Nolan was at his desk typing up a report when Caitlin burst into the office lobby, heels clicking like gunfire. "You can't just walk away from me," she shouted, mascara streaking as she waved his letter like a battle flag. Heads turned, co-workers gawked. Nolan's pulse raced, but he kept his voice steady. "Caitlin, go home." Security stepped in, ushering her out as she yelled about fixing this. He sat back down, hands shaking, feeling every eye in the room on him. By lunch, the whispers had started. Half pity, half gossip. Even his boss called him in, eyebrow raised. "Trouble at home?" he asked, more curious than concerned. Nolan rubbed his neck. "Divorce isn't exactly a picnic, sir." The boss chuckled, letting it slide, but the incident clung to Nolan like a bad smell for days. Caitlin didn't stop there. Over the next week, she spun a web of rumors among their mutual friends. To some, Nolan was having a nervous breakdown, a fragile man unmoored by his own weakness. To others, he'd fallen into an affair, seduced by a more experienced, domineering woman who'd taken him under her wing. The irony wasn't lost on Nolan. If anyone was domineering, it had been her. A few friends swallowed her stories whole, texting him sanctimonious advice about getting help. But others, those who'd seen the slow suffocation up close, stood by him. "She's rewriting history," his old buddy Mike said over beers one night. "Don't let her gaslight you into doubting this." Nolan didn't doubt it. Not anymore. Each day in that empty apartment, with its leaky sink and creaky floors, felt like a brick laid in a new foundation. The rifle stayed in the corner, a quiet symbol of the pieces of himself he was taking back. Caitlin's storm raged on outside, but inside he was starting to feel the calm. Caitlin didn't fade quietly into the background. After the initial whirlwind of anger and tears, she pivoted, hard. Her tactics shifted like seasons. First came the concern phase, with texts like, "I'm worried about you, Nolan. Are you eating enough?" Then nostalgia crept in, voice messages dripping with syrupy memories. "Remember our trip to the coast? We were so happy. We could be again." She even tried tracking him down, once showing up at his usual coffee shop, forcing him to duck out the back with his latte still steaming. Nolan didn't bite. He kept his replies short. "I'm fine," or didn't answer at all, building a wall of silence she couldn't climb. 3 weeks later, he had to face the house again. Divorce papers in one hand, a cardboard box in the other, he pulled up to reclaim the last of his things. A few books, some old vinyls, a jacket Caitlin had always hated. He'd timed it for when she'd be at work, but as he stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. Then he saw her, Margaret, perched on the couch like a vulture in pearls, her lips pursed tight. "You've destroyed her, you know," she started, voice quivering with rehearsed indignation. "My Caitlin's a wreck because of you. Years of her life wasted on a man who can't even try." She stood, clutching a tissue she didn't need, and launched into a sermon about duty, sacrifice, how Nolan had failed her daughter. "She gave you everything, and this is how you repay her? With selfishness? Shame on you." Nolan set the box down, his jaw tight. 5 years ago, he'd have withered under her guilt trip, stammered apologies he didn't mean. Not today. "I wanted a partnership, Margaret," he said, his voice steady, cutting through her tirade. "Not this." He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, the life he'd been squeezed into. For the first time he saw it clearly. Margaret wasn't just Caitlin's cheerleader. She was the architect. The control, the rules, the warped idea that love meant obedience, it all traced back to her. Margaret blinked, caught off guard, then doubled down. "You're ungrateful," she spat. "Caitlin learned how to be a wife from me, and we know what men need." "Stop!" Nolan snapped, slamming the divorce papers onto the table. The sound echoed, sharp and final. "Just shut your mouth, Margaret. You're the poison here, not me. You twisted her into this, your little puppet project with a screwed-up playbook." He grabbed his box, adrenaline surging. "She's your mess, not mine." Margaret gaped, words tumbling out in a frantic jumble, something about respect, family, God, but Nolan was already halfway out the door. The weight of the box felt lighter now, the papers on the table a line in the sand. Caitlin wasn't just Caitlin, he realized. She was Margaret's echo, molded by decades of venom dressed up as wisdom. He'd spent years dodging the daughter's strings, blind to the mother pulling them. Driving away, the house shrinking in his rearview mirror, Nolan felt a strange calm settle in. Caitlin could text, Margaret could preach, but he was done being their audience. The apartment waited, empty, imperfect, his. For the first time in forever, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. A month after the showdown with Margaret, the divorce was finalized. The finances, the furniture, the half-paid mortgage on the house, all split down the middle. Caitlin had clawed for more, arguing she deserved it for her years of effort. But the judge saw through the noise. The house went up for sale, the proceeds halved, and Nolan walked away with his share and a signature on the dotted line. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was fair. For him, that was enough. A year later, Nolan's life looked different. Smaller, but his own. His apartment was a patchwork of choices. A worn leather couch he'd picked out, bookshelves, that old rifle mounted on the wall like a quiet trophy. No one dictated where the coffee mugs went or how the cushions sat. The space breathed with him, a harmony he hadn't known he'd been missing. He'd learned to spot manipulation a mile away now, whether it was a co-worker's subtle power play, a friend's guilt trip, or a date's coy pushiness. The books from the gym locker days had done their work. His career had taken off too. He'd quit the old job, too many whispers after Caitlin's lobby meltdown, and landed a new gig with travel perks he'd once only dreamed of. Last month, he'd pitched a project in Seattle, sipping coffee by the waterfront afterward, marveling at how far he'd come. The road wasn't always smooth. Nights alone still stung sometimes, but they were his to shape. Then came the chance encounter. He was at the mall grabbing a new pair of boots when he spotted Caitlin across the food court. She hadn't changed. Same sharp jawline, same commanding stride. But there was a man trailing her now, a lanky guy with a dazed look, carrying her bags like a pack mule. She locked eyes with Nolan and froze, then plastered on a smile. "Hey," she said, too casual. "Want to grab a coffee, catch up?" Nolan shifted his bag to the other shoulder. "No thanks," he replied, calm and firm. "We've got nothing left to say. It's done." Her smile faltered, and she tilted her head, tossing out a parting shot. "You look rough, Nolan. Hope you're okay." It was a jab, her last little hook, but it bounced off him. He knew he didn't look rough. He felt alive. She just couldn't stand that he didn't need her approval anymore. Back home, he poured a glass of whiskey and sank into his couch, her old words drifting back. A real man should be obedient. That's when life gets happier. What a load of nonsense. He almost laughed out loud. A real man didn't bend to someone else's tune. He stayed true to his own beat, even when it meant walking alone. Nolan had chosen the harder path. Autonomy, stumbles, the occasional quiet night with just his thoughts. But in that, he'd found something real, relief, not the shallow peace of surrender. The biggest change, though, was with women. Where he'd once fumbled, he now moved with ease. Flirting came naturally, a playful confidence he hadn't known he had. Dates were fun again. Dinners, hikes, late-night talks, each one a small adventure. He didn't rush, though. No diving headfirst into anything serious. He'd learned that lesson. Freedom wasn't just leaving Caitlin. It was owning his time, his choices, his spirit. Nolan leaned back, the whiskey warm in his hand, the apartment quiet around him. Outside, the world kept spinning, but in here, he'd built something solid. Not perfect, not loud, but his. And that, he thought, was the happiest life of all. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.